Thank you for joining us today. In today's presentation, we will discuss the procedure for setting up a credit card vendor in Sage BusinessWorks. The first step in setting up a credit card vendor is to create a new vendor record. To do this, we're going to AP, Vendors, Maintain Vendors, and then we'll click on the white piece of paper to create a new vendor. I'm going to set up a record for the Capital One card. Since this is just for demonstration, I'm only going to fill in the name and address. And then I'm going to select the credit card vendor checkbox. Once I select that box, then the system tells me specifically what the next step will be, which we will get to in just a moment. We will need to set up a payment term specifically for this credit card vendor. I'm going to say OK to the message and save this vendor record. The next step in setting up our credit card vendor is to set up the payment terms specifically for that credit card vendor. To do that, we'll go to Accounts Payable, Utilities, Maintain Payment Terms. We'll click on the binoculars so that we can select a payment term that hasn't been used yet. Then we'll select the credit card terms checkbox. Once we do that, only the description and credit card vendor are available. Once we select the lookup for the credit card vendor, only those vendors that we have selected the credit card vendor checkbox for upon setup are available to select. I'm going to select the one that we set up for the Capital One. And then I'm going to save this payment term. Now there are two options for entering an invoice that is going to be paid with a credit card. The first option would be if you already know at the time of entering the invoice that you're going to pay it with that credit card. In that case, we will enter the invoice. For our example, we're going to pay the PG&E. $150. And in the terms, we're going to select the Capital One in the drop-down. And then we're going to post that invoice. Now to show what happens when you pay an invoice by credit card in BusinessWorks, I'm going to go to the Accounts Payable Detail Report. I'm just going to select transactions for the date that I entered that invoice. Now you can see for the PG&E vendor that the invoice that we entered, invoice 159 for $150, was paid by the Capital One terms. So you can see the invoice and the payment history. Then for the Capital One vendor, you can see that it created a new invoice for that vendor. So now we have payment history in the PG&E vendor showing that invoice entered and paid. Now we have a new invoice for the Capital One vendor that needs to be paid. The second option would be if you were entering the accounts payable invoice for your vendor and at that time you did not know that you were going to pay it with a credit card later. In that case, you would enter the invoice as normal. And leave the payment terms as they would normally be. And post the invoice. Then, if you decided to pay that invoice by credit card, you can go to Accounts Payable, Checks, enter Payments, select the vendor, select Credit Card, and then select the vendor, the credit card vendor that you want to pay that invoice with. Whatever you type in the reference is going to be the new invoice number that will be created under that credit card vendor account. We'll select the invoice that we want to pay and post the payment. Now we'll print the accounts payable detail report for that date so that we can see it does the same thing. Now we can see that we created the invoice for PG&E, and then we later paid that invoice through the Enter Payments option, but we selected the Capital One credit card as our payment. So we can see the invoice, the payment, and then it creates a new invoice that's now due and payable for the Capital One vendor. So remember, the 2 steps in setting up a credit card vendor is first you set up a new vendor for the credit card and make sure to check the credit card vendor checkbox. And also you set up a different payment term for each of the credit card vendors that you set up. Also remember, there are 2 options for paying invoices by credit card. The first is if you know the invoice is going to be paid by the credit card, you would select the credit card payment terms at the time of entering the invoice for the vendor. Then what would happen is that invoice would instantly be closed and a new invoice for the credit card vendor would be opened. The second option is if you aren't sure if the invoice is going to be paid by the credit card. Then you would enter the invoice as normal, and then at a later time, you could use the Enter Payments feature to pay the invoice. And then you would select the credit card radio button for the payment type and select the credit card vendor from the lookup. Thank you for viewing our presentation today on setting up credit card vendors. You can visit our website again for other quick task presentations.